In this video, I'm going to restore this little old block plane.
I'm not 100% certain, but I think this is an old Stanley 102 plane, and according to the internet, they were first manufactured back in 1884, although I doubt this one's quite as old as that. I've restored a few wood planes now, but never a block plane, but I'm sure the fundamentals are the same, and this one isn't in terrible condition.
Now, I don't know much about the history of this particular plane, but my granddad gave it to me, and he says he found it on a job site around 20 years ago, left behind by some joiners. So who knows what this plane might have been used for in the past. You can see here where the blade has been struck many times to make micro adjustments to it, so much that that metal is now rounded over. So let's give it a test and then see if we can restore it.
It actually performed surprisingly well to say it's been sat unused for years, but it's far from perfect, and there's a lot we can do to make it work much better. A good thing about this plane is just how simple it is. It's only got 4 components: the body, the blade, the lever cap, and the adjustment wheel to tighten things down. Apart from a bit of rust and dirt, this block plane is in good condition, and it shouldn't take too much to get it back in good working order. And the first step I'm taking is to give all the components a good clean and polish. Once I'd gotten through some of the dirt, I couldn't tell if the rough metal was just pitted from corrosion or if it was manufactured that way, but I'll take a look at that shortly. Some areas were a bit too much for the maroon pad and wire brushes to manage, so I switched to a wire wheel in a drill, which made things much easier. And it worked a treat on this lever cap, removing all the old paint and leaving a lovely polished finish to the old cast iron. I continued with the drill for the areas I could reach, but then switched back to brushes to get into the tighter gaps.
Okay, so I've got these 3 pieces nice and cleaned up, apart from the blade. I'm going to tackle that separately in a bit. What I'm going to move on to now is these sides are a little bit pitted, a little bit rough. They were probably always that way, but I'd quite like to give it a nice smooth finish on there. Now, unlike a bench plane where they have nice flat sides, this side is convex. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my maroon pad, lay it flat on the bench. I'm going to take a piece of sandpaper, lay that on top, and then work the plane back and forth. My idea being that the maroon pad has some give to it, so it will form to the shape of the plane, and I should be able to get it lovely and smooth.
If I'd just laid sandpaper flat on the bench, I'd have had to rock the plane to properly smooth the curve. And if I didn't get it quite right, I'd end up sanding flat spots onto it. Doing it this way meant all I really had to do was push it back and forth. Doing this made a big difference to the side of the plane, but I decided not to go too far because I didn't want to make the sides too thin. I cleaned up the other side and then did more or less the same to the toe and the heel. Again, not aiming for a completely perfect machine finish on here, but a little smoother and nicer than previously. Okay, with some of the more cosmetic steps out of the way, it was time to move on to flattening the sole. Ideally, I'd have some kind of perfectly flat surface plate, but I've had good results previously with a thickish piece of MDF, so that's what I'm using here. It's important before I start on the sole that I reassemble the plane, as once everything is tightened and under tension, the plane may flex a little bit. So if I was to flatten it without doing this and then reassemble it, I'd likely end up with a slight bulge in the middle. A started with just a few strokes back and forth to get an idea of how flat the sole is overall currently, and I can already see where the high and low spots are. But to make things easier to see, I'm going to add a few lines with a permanent marker. Then, if I take just a few more strokes and have a look, I can see immediately where the high spots are, and I know I need to keep flattening until I've removed all of the lines. Whilst doing this, I'm trying to apply pressure evenly over the whole plane to make sure I'm not working too much in one area.
Okay, so this is looking much cleaner at this stage, but it's not finished yet. I wasn't able to get the bottom perfectly flat with the tools that I've got, but it's the best I can do, and it's definitely flatter and smoother than it was. The next thing I want to do is soften all of these edges here. As I've been flattening everything, they've become quite sharp, so I'm just going to spend a little bit of time softening those edges, and then I'll turn my focus to the blade.
There's probably a more scientific way to do this, but I just took some 240 grit sandpaper and ran all the edges over it until they didn't feel quite as harsh. I also did a more aggressive softening on the toe and the heel using a file, and this should help stop the plane from getting caught on little lumps and bumps when planing pieces of wood. Right, time to work on the blade, and this was probably the most challenging part of the process. I began by filing off the rounded over section on the back of the blade, which was the easy bit, and then moved on to flattening the blade, which was the hard part. I started by working on the front and back, or top and bottom of the blade, and this was pretty tricky as the blade was quite uneven and had a lot of high spots, as you can see here. Now, I'm certainly no expert when it comes to flattening and sharpening plane blades, and I think my lack of experience combined with it being a very cold British winter day meant that I probably rushed this step a bit, and I didn't properly flatten the blade before moving on to sharpening it. I did most of the sharpening with a guide, and then switched to freehand for the last few strokes on the fine diamond plate, then gave it a strop, and gave everything a little coat of oil before putting it back together. Oops, that probably didn't help things. Once it was all back together, I struggled for a while trying to get it to cut well, and eventually I got it working okay, but I thought I could probably do better. So I took it apart again and went back to flattening. My theory is that my previous corner cutting and laziness was to blame, so I decided to make sure that the sharp end of the blade was much flatter this time. I think because it wasn't very flat previously, it meant I couldn't get a good edge when sharpening, and it didn't sit flush with the other parts of the plane.
So I've got the underside of the blade flattened and the top side of the blade a bit flatter, which is where the cap iron will meet the blade. I'm also going to flatten this bit out here a little bit because I think the better contact I have in there, the better it will be once all of this is set and bedded together in the plane. So I'm going to give this a little flatten, give it another sharpen again, put it together, and hopefully it'll work a lot better. Okay, I think I'm pretty happy with that. This whole front area that touches the blade is pretty flat now, so I think that will create a really nice, tight contact point and hopefully stop any wood shavings getting trapped in there. If they still do, I can always come back here and finesse it even more, but I'm pretty keen to try this as is after I've sharpened it, and see if flattening things further has made any difference. Okay, so silly me, forgot to hit the record button for the last couple of steps, but essentially I went up through the 600 grit, the 1000 grit, and then the 6000 grit waterstone that I've got, and then onto the strop on the underside, the top side, the blade, resharpened that, and then the cap iron. At least I think that's what this is called. So I'm going to put it all together in the plain body, give it a test. Just going to tap the right side a little bit. Okay, I think that's taking very fine shaving now. Super smooth. So there we go. Nice and sharp. I think it's earned a place on my tool shelf.
If you've enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, as I've got a lot more ideas and projects that I want to build using these tools in the future. And if you've got any ideas, let me know in the comments. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.